Every week, there's a headline. A vaccine has skipped animal tests and gone on to human trials. The race is on, but there are still tests on animals. Putting the vaccine race in context. That's next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Amid all the COVID news and the climbing death toll, the media tries to be optimistic when there's good news, like when companies make announcements about a possible breakthrough vaccine. At last count, 10 companies have gone on to human trials in the race for a vaccine. That some animal tests were skipped is a major animal rights victory. But some companies still test on animals simultaneously. So how would you view the latest news in the vaccine race? How positive should you be? And how do you guard against false hope? PETA Science Advisor Jeffrey Brown says this is a pivotal moment in drug development in the United States. But any announcements about vaccines are in the very early stages. We are still far from a vaccine that can be regarded as a cure. Still, many animal lives have been spared as a route for researchers has been streamlined. That's a giant plus. Brown has seen researchers fail in trying to find vaccines for MERS or SARS or HIV in his career. But despite all that, he remains hopeful. Here's my interview with PETA Science Advisor Jeffrey Brown on the PETA Podcast.
One of the leading vaccine candidates that's in development for preventing COVID-19 that's made by this company called Moderna. It was allowed by the Food and Drug Administration to be used in humans without first going through these time-consuming and misleading animal tests that are otherwise required before any new treatment, not just vaccines, can be put into human clinical trials. So the broad strokes summary of this is that the FDA knows that animal testing is dispensable. They know that it slows down the discovery of safe and effective vaccines. And right now, that issue of speed is essential. You know, animal testing for new drugs usually takes years, and 95% of the time they don't work in humans. So because literally billions of lives are hanging in the balance here, we don't have years to wait. And the FDA's response to COVID-19 proves that we can respond in weeks and months instead of years by skipping these unnecessary animal tests.
All right, so that's been a positive, and we acknowledge that. This you mentioned Moderna in collaboration with the National Institutes of Health. It's had some preliminary results that have come from human tests, and we're being told it's positive. Can you explain exactly what that means? How positive should we take all this?
It's been quite positive. I think there can be a different set of terms that are used in this field than are used, you know, in newspapers and so on. But in both cases right now, what Moderna has seen are very good things. So the usual progression of vaccine development is that after years of tests in non-human animals to show that on the one hand, the vaccine is safe, it doesn't cause, you know, side effects that are unpleasant. And on the other hand, that in species other than our own, that it does prevent this illness. That 95% of the time, drugs and vaccines that go through that process and sail through the animal tests, you know, and they suggest that a vaccine is safe and effective. As soon as those drugs get into human clinical trials, they fail 95% of the time. That's a really bad failure rate. So in a situation like this, what Moderna has seen is that the vaccine that they're making, it more or less follows a recipe that the FDA is comfortable with, right? The way that this vaccine is made, the mechanism that it uses to confer protection in people who receive the vaccine, they're well established. So This is a perfect situation where the FDA, this company Moderna, the National Institutes of Health, they were all in agreement in saying, this is a really good time for us to say, let's jump this years-long process of animal testing and just go right into the first very small group of people to receive the vaccine. So that's what's been happening for the last couple of months. And it's a small group, right? It's 45 people. In the initial round, the first phase of clinical tests, they're really there to just say, all right, are we sure that this vaccine is safe? They're not looking yet at, does this prevent illness? What they need first is to say, if 45 people get this vaccine, after your body has had a chance to respond to it, is everybody okay? And so far, everybody is doing great. And the people who are running this trial are looking at the blood work, from the people who are involved, and they're saying, not only are everybody doing okay, but we kind of see their immune system reacting in the way we want. So already the FDA has said, we agree, this is going great. So let's recruit more people to this study. And that's what's coming next, just expanding the group of people who are receiving this vaccine.
So from this small group, many thousands, hundreds, how many more people in this expansive test?
To be determined. It'll probably be a few hundred, but it may be more. There's been tremendous interest from the public in participating in human clinical trials for these vaccines. Thousands and thousands of people have signed up to volunteer. So what's happened so far for this vaccine in particular is that sometimes when a clinical trial starts, the people who are running the study will wait for it. If they say we want 45 people to be in the study, they'll wait until they found all 45 people and they'll start everybody at the same time. That hasn't happened for this vaccine. As soon as people were recruited to the study and they met the inclusion criteria, right, so they could participate, as soon as they qualified, they got their first shot. 2 weeks later, they got their second shot. So what's happened is that we're at a point now where the first 8 people who've had this vaccine, they've had both doses and enough time has passed that their immune systems have had a chance to respond to it. And just based on those 8 people, not even all 45 people recruited to the study, those first 8 people responded so well that the FDA said, this is enough. Like we know now that more people can be recruited. So it remains to be seen just how many people will be recruited to this new study. But there are several phases of this process. And each time a checkpoint is passed, more people get drawn in. So ultimately, yes, thousands of people probably will be recruited to that study.
All right. But at this point, the positive means, all right, safe at this point, but without animal tests, I guess we should know much sooner if it doesn't work, right? I mean, because we've bypassed animal tests. We're testing on humans now.
Exactly right. 100%. When we say that we've bypassed these animal tests, maybe bypass is the wrong word. We do know that this company is doing animal tests alongside tests in people, but by shifting those things around, it does make it clear that the intention behind these animal tests, the way it's usually discussed by the FDA, is that these are safeguards for human safety. But what we're seeing now is that those safeguards aren't doing what they were sort of intended to do. So now, what we're already seeing is the proof is in the pudding, right? So if people can get these vaccines that are made in really well-established ways, we kind of know that surprises are less of a concern. And it's easier to see right out of the gate, all right, this does look safe. So if this Moderna vaccine had gone through a traditional approach, we would still be years away from the first people receiving the vaccine. And if that vaccine had done just fine in non-human animals, but the second it went into people, it made them sick in some way, it would have failed out of the process. So now we know, just not even 3 full months away from the initial development of this vaccine, we know that it's pretty safe. And that's an amazing acceleration of this process.
So we know it's safe, but we don't know if it cures anything. So that's still the open question. And then you mentioned something in your answer. Moderna is still testing on animals, so it hasn't eliminated animal testing altogether.
Yeah, that's right. This is a thorny situation because the law that governs how drugs get onto the market still says that certain tests, many of which use animals, are required. So at some point, companies are still bound and restricted by what the law says. But this is a first step in that direction where we're seeing that not only are companies confident and willing to press the agency to say, we really need to just find out if this is effective in humans, if it's safe in humans, right up front. This is how change happens. There have to be test cases. And this is a test case showing that the FDA is comfortable acknowledging that this is the only way that a drug can get on the market in 1 or 2 years instead of a decade or more. So it can kind of seem like a double-edged sword. There are still animal tests being conducted, but once vaccines that go through this process that put human tests at the forefront, once the FDA sees how these tests go from start to finish, then there's sort of a playbook for the future. And there's no doubt that the next round of drugs that will be going through this process will kind of start with this argument instead of saying, well, we should do animal tests. They'll go right to the forefront and say, this is safe enough. We can start these human clinical trials.
Right. Because as you said, the thorniness of the issue is that we know that the animal tests don't accomplish as much when we try to, see how it applies to humans. And so when we see companies still test, it's almost like that's a regulation that's saying they have to test, or are they just covering their tails, as it were?
The bottom line is that there's no way around a law, right? So there are ways to shift things around, and FDA has done a very good thing. They've formed what they call the Coronavirus Treatment Acceleration Program, and it's the agency's way of coming forward and saying, essentially, look, we know that the laws are on the books that say you have to do all this animal testing, but why don't we try something new? Because everyone feels this sense of urgency about having an effective human relevant treatment. So it's baby steps, I guess you could say, except this is a very big step. That right now there are, at last count, there are 141 vaccines in development. And the one that we're talking about, Moderna, that's just one. So some steps have to be taken initially to convince the agency and the industry that makes these vaccines and drugs to say, all right, everyone is coming to this in good faith. The science is good, and we can just plot out how this can be done in the future without using animals.
All right. So now, what is PETA doing to even make it go faster? I understand that you've gone to the FDA, you've written them a letter. What are you saying to the FDA?
That's right. PETA works with the Food and Drug Administration quite a lot on situations very similar to this. And what we've asked the FDA in this situation, we've gone right to the commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. And we've said that if the FDA is willing to look at coronavirus treatments and vaccines that can be used to help push this pandemic into the past, if they're willing to look at this situation and say animal testing is slowing things down, it's making the drugs that do reach the market much more expensive, there's no reason to stop at coronavirus treatments. So what we're doing is pushing the FDA to say, let's rely on really efficient and effective animal-free tests instead of misleading animal tests for all new drug development. This shouldn't stop just at the coronavirus.
Well, one thing for sure, there is this race for a vaccine. Now, you've been working in this field before you came to PETA for quite some time. Have you I guess if there's always a cure that's worth going for, researchers are going to go for it and keep trying. But have you ever seen anything quite like this? I mean, we haven't had a vaccine for MERS or SARS or HIV even. And yet now we have, you said 110 vaccines. We have 10 companies out there racing in this, for a vaccine. Have you ever seen anything like this?
Absolutely not. This is, without a doubt, an unprecedented situation. And the gravity of just how unprecedented this is a really, I mean, it's a crucial way to underline that we're in this paradigm shift moment. Now more than ever, everyone is in agreement. We can't afford to waste time on animal tests that failed to translate into new treatments and vaccines for people. And what we can lean back on is just an awareness of, why does the FDA require all these animal tests? Mm-hmm. And if you go back into the history of how these laws got put into place in the early and mid 1900s, when the pharmaceutical industry was first developing, it was an unregulated market. So companies could put whatever they wanted on the market. They could make these wild claims about what drugs did. And people were being poisoned all the time. The history of drug development is littered with these stories of these sort of like snake oil treatments. So that's how we ended up with what we know as the Food and Drug Administration today. So those laws got put in place in response to current events, and they were built to be flexible and changeable. But since then, we've not been confronted with this massive, sudden situation like a pandemic that really brings into focus, wait a minute, maybe we can do things better now than we did when those laws were written 50, 60, 70 years ago. And things like the FDA coming up with this coronavirus treatment acceleration program, those are the agency's baby steps in the direction of saying, we know that these laws still exist that say companies have to do these animal tests. But you know what? We're going to put out some new policies that say, actually, that's more flexible. Companies, come to us with your ideas. And one of those ideas is, show us just how safe you know that these new candidate drugs might be based on these modern non-animal tests that you're doing. And let's prioritize that information over these old animal tests that have been on the books for decades.
All right, that's a good thing to point out. One thing I want people to take away from our conversation is when they see a headline, and it's always presented as, here's promising news, here's a vaccine, here's an animal test. I want people to come away knowing how to view an animal test. So when they hear in a news story that here's a vaccine, it's been tested, it's been tested on animals, immediately, what's the first thought that should go in their minds?
This is such a good point. Every story that you see that says promising new therapy, this vaccine prevented progression of HIV into AIDS, there's usually ... in animals, in some animal species. And I mentioned the HIV AIDS vaccine sector because we've been trying since the early 1980s to develop an HIV vaccine. And you can't count the number of times that very splashy headlines have come out to say just as much. Promising new drug, promising new vaccine. But they've all failed once they've gotten to humans. So it's very helpful to read these stories with a critical eye and recognize how many times the headline doesn't hold up to the story, because the story ends up saying we've prevented HIV or insert illness here in some non-human animal species. We still don't have an HIV vaccine, right? So in situations like that, this does lead everyone back to this recognition that's very well known in this field of drug development, that proving that a new drug works in a species that's not a human in no way predicts whether it will work in humans.
So every time you see a news story, and this week we've seen a number, like just as on this day that we're talking, Novavax has announced that it's beginning human trials. Gilead still in the news. And in fact, they had a report leaked last Friday, which showed that, well, it did slow down or help recovery time, but there were something like 32 deaths from, in the trial and 54 from the placebo. So they couldn't say it had any survival benefits, but they could say, well, it cuts down on time. So remdesivir is sort of not quite the drug, the wonder drug that people may have hoped. Or how should we look at that story?
You're right. It's not a wonder drug. And drugs like remdesivir are really interesting components to this question of how do we deal with the coronavirus pandemic? Because on the one hand, with vaccines like what Moderna is making, those are drugs that you receive to prevent you from contracting or developing this illness. There are many, many more drugs that are being looked at to treat illness once someone has already contracted the coronavirus. So I mentioned before there are 141 vaccines in development to try to prevent this coronavirus, but there are 223 treatments that are going through the development phases to address the illness once someone has it. So the good thing about the treatment side of things is that we already have thousands of drugs that are already on the market and approved to treat other illnesses or conditions, and many more treatments that companies have started to develop, but maybe they've put them on the shelf because they couldn't quite get the data they needed to say that they work for a treatment. So now what companies are doing is they're going back through these catalogs of drugs that have already been approved for the market. And they're saying, well, which of these, as a, essentially as just a consequence, which of these do have some effectiveness, which can be used as a treatment in some way for the virus. And that's exactly where remdesivir fits in. It's not a magic bullet, but it's already been through all the testing, and companies can say, whatever, we'll take what we can get right now. If it shortens the illness by 1 day, that's a benefit.
Well, this seems to be a path that everyone is taking. Merck announced it's working on 2 vaccines, one that worked on Ebola, and so they're going to see if that could be repurposed. And there's, we mentioned remdesivir. There's this other one, Nuvavax. I mean, every day there seems to be one. Everyone, though, when they hear these stories, they should be critical. And well, first of all, let me ask this question. Is this the right path to take these underutilized or these older drugs that have already been through the mill with one disease? Is that the right way that we're going to get to something or an answer in this virus, do you think?
It's one of many right ways. And I say that because in many instances, these aren't drugs that are just at the very beginning stages of development, right? These are drugs that we already have. They're packaged up, they're in pill form or in shots that people can receive. And look, there's another sort of lesson here in the dangers of relying on animal tests before these drugs ever get to humans. A lot of these drugs, even if they weren't put on the market, drug companies have enormous catalogs of promising drug candidates that they wanted to develop, but they performed poorly in animal tests. So they had to be put on the shelf. They could never go into human studies. So if you think about that figure, that 95% failure rate of drugs that sail through animal tests but fail in humans, the number of drugs that fail in animal tests and never get to human clinical trials is even bigger. It's much bigger. So what's valuable about switching this system up is there are these computer-based approaches where companies and research institutes at universities are going back and they're looking at how does this coronavirus work and what drugs, whether they're on the market or whether they're in this category of drugs that have just been put on the shelf because the animal tests didn't do well. And they're saying, well, we're seeing some of these might work against the coronavirus in humans. And so of those 223 treatments that are being explored right now, many of those fall into that category. And it reminds us that just because a drug fails animal tests, that really doesn't say anything about how a human would react to it. So some of these clinical trials that are starting up now are that category of drugs that really might have a lot of promise for treating this illness, but because in the past they failed an animal test, they had to be put on the shelf.
So an answer may be in the retread.
Absolutely.
There might be an answer in there. Yeah. All right. Jeff, I really appreciate you coming on. Every time I see a headline, I say, well, what would Jeff think about this? Would he be jaundiced to look at it with a critical eye? You've been in this field. You've looked at where breakthroughs have come through. Do you think that this is going to be where the answer might lie? And in going over some of these older drugs that may have been, discarded or shelved, that there may be an answer there?
I think that there's an enormous likelihood that there will be good treatments in this backlog of drugs that were developed but failed in animal tests. The future remains to be seen, but I mean, think about these numbers: 223 treatments in development, 141 vaccines in development. This has never happened. We've never been in a position where just a few months into a pandemic, this amount of effort has been put into looking at what can we do now. So the ultimate solution will probably be that we'll have a few treatments, a few vaccines that are effective. And the more work gets put into not reinventing the wheel, right? Let's maximize the use of drugs that have already been developed. Even if they've been tested in animals in the past, then trying to make sure that humans get access to promising candidates means that an entirely new drug doesn't have to be developed, because an entirely new drug, again, would have to go through so much animal testing. So we will end up with a mixture of promising tools in this toolbox. There won't be a single silver bullet. We'll have many tools. And this approach, this intention to accelerate how treatments are looked at by using these innovative ways that don't prioritize animal tests anymore is an excellent step toward making sure that we get as many of those as possible, as quickly as possible.
Jeff, you are so positive. And I like that, because you have, the record in terms of producing a vaccine for all these other diseases, from SARS to MERS to HIV. And yet this rush, you take hope from the fact that there's this tremendous rush for this particular vaccine.
Absolutely. And look, this is something like it is a sea change in this field. Drug development, the research that goes into it will never be the same. And I'm not one to say that there are silver linings to this pandemic. This is an awful situation. At the same time, this is forcing us, everyone in this field, to look at how we do business. And the brilliant part about the response to it is that it's not just PETA saying that the animal tests are slowing us down. It's government agencies, it's research institutes, it's hospitals saying, we really need to reevaluate this. And everyone is aware now that one essential way of reevaluating it is to take some of this animal suffering out of the picture and really start moving things ahead forward. So optimism is a good thing right now.
Jeffrey Brown, PETA's science advisor in the regulatory testing department, on how to guard against false hope. Although basically Jeff is very optimistic that there's going to be something coming out of this new approach to science in terms of drug development in our nation. For more information, go to PETA.org. And that's our program. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. That's the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund blog, where I write about civil rights and Asian Americans, or on my personal website, amok.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.